Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to follow one small but life-changing market trip when Tu Tien sets out before dawn with 60 handmade sticky rice cakes, trembling with fear, and comes home with an empty basket, her first real success and the proof that she can help build her family's future with her own hands. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The first light of dawn slipped over the mountains and into the yard, turning the mist pale gold as it drifted between the banana trees. Everything still felt half asleep. The leaves, the path, the low roof of the kitchen, but Tu Tien was already awake, already moving. The house carried that familiar early morning quiet of countryside life, where even the smallest sound seemed clearer. The rustle of leaves, the faraway call of birds, the soft scrape of her sandals on the floor. She stood in the kitchen with both hands full, wrapping the last of the sticky rice cakes she had worked on since before sunrise. Banana leaves, softened by steam, lay spread neatly beside her. The fillings were ready, the strings cut, the basket waiting. One by one, she folded each cake tightly, carefully, as if each one carried more than rice and meat, as if it carried a piece of the future she was trying to build with her own hands. The room smelled of soaked, glutinous rice, mung beans, pork seasoned with shallots and pepper, and the faint green scent of fresh banana leaves. It was a warm, living smell, the kind that wrapped itself around the walls and made the whole kitchen feel like effort, care, and hope had taken physical form. Tu Tien paused for a second and looked at the basket. 60 cakes. Not a huge number. Not enough to change their lives overnight, but enough to matter. She had thought about this for days. If the cakes sold, even with only a small profit, it would still mean something. It would mean she could stay home more, work close to the house, still help bring money in, and maybe ease the pressure on Jack little by little. That mattered more to her than the amount itself. She didn't want to sit at home waiting for him to carry everything alone. She wanted to stand beside him in whatever way she could, even if it began with something as simple as sticky rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves. She tied the final knot and placed the cake gently into the basket. At that exact moment, she heard footsteps behind her. Jack stepped into the kitchen, still looking slightly rumpled from sleep. His shirt was wrinkled at the shoulder, and his hair had not fully settled yet, but his eyes were already awake. The first thing he looked at was not her face, but the basket. "You finished all of them?" he asked softly. Tu Tien turned and smiled, though the nervousness inside her was already building. "Almost. Just the last few." Jack stepped closer and looked down at the basket as if it were something precious. In a way, it was. He knew how much work stood behind those neat rows of cakes, the soaking, grinding, steaming, chopping, frying, wrapping. He also knew what it meant for her to decide to go out and sell them. For someone else, this might have looked small. For Tu Tien, it was a step, a real one. "I'll take you to the market," he said. She looked up at him at once. "You have work." "I do," he nodded, "but I'm still taking you." She hesitated. "You don't need to. I can go by myself." Jack gave her the kind of look that made it clear the conversation was already finished. "I know you can. I'm still going." That made her laugh softly, and some of the tightness in her chest eased. From the doorway, his mother watched them with a quiet smile. She had been up already too, moving around the house the way older women do, calm, efficient, always aware of what needed to be done before anyone else asked. "Sell early," she reminded them. "Once the market gets busy, people start rushing. In the morning, they still stop to look." Tu Tien nodded quickly. "Yes, Mom." His mother came closer and lifted one of the cakes from the side tray, where a few broken ones had been set aside. "Eat first before you go. No one sells well on an empty stomach." So the three of them sat down together in the small kitchen, sharing the cakes that had not been neat enough for the basket. The rice was still a little warm at the center, the peanuts fragrant, the pork savory and rich without being heavy. Tu Tien ate more slowly than usual, not because she wasn't hungry, but because her mind was already at the market, imagining the cloth laid out, the first customer, the possibility of no one stopping. Jack, on the other hand, had already started calculating. If the total cost is around 180 to 200,000, he murmured, half to himself, half to her, and you sell each one for 5,000. Tu Tien smiled. Then if they all sell, there'll be a little profit. A little? Jack lifted an eyebrow. That's more than a little. His mother nodded approvingly. Enough to keep going. That sentence stayed with Tu Tien. Enough to keep going. That was what she wanted. Not quick success, not something flashy, just something steady, something honest, something that belonged to her hands and could grow little by little into real support for the family. Jack finished eating, stood, and lifted the basket as if testing its weight. You packed them well, he said. Tu Tien wiped her hands and looked at him. I hope people think so too. They will. He said it without hesitation. And somehow that confidence moved through her more deeply than she expected. A little while later, they stepped out into the yard. The mountain mist still clung low to the leaves, but the light had grown brighter. The motorbike stood waiting near the gate. Jack tied the basket securely, checked the straps twice, then looked back at her. Ready? Tu Tien took one last breath of the cool morning air and nodded. As the motorbike rolled out onto the road, she sat behind him with both arms wrapped around the basket, feeling every turn, every rise in the road, every gust of cold wind that slipped through the folds of her shirt. The world looked different from the back of the bike that morning, larger somehow, more open, but also more uncertain. She was not simply going to market. She was stepping out of the quiet role she had lived in for too long, the woman who waited at home, who hoped, who worried. Today, she would sit in front of strangers and ask them to buy what she had made. It sounded ordinary. It felt enormous. The market was still sparse when they arrived. Only a few stalls were fully set up. The morning calls of early vendors rose and fell around them. Somewhere nearby, vegetables were being unloaded. A child was crying. A woman laughed too loudly at something that happened near the fish section. The mountain wind still moved through the open parts of the market, cool enough to make the place feel unfinished. Jack found her a small space and helped spread a cloth on the ground. Tu Tien set the basket down, opened it carefully, and arranged the cakes in neat rows so the banana leaves showed their clean green folds. Then she sat. For 1 second, all her confidence disappeared. People walked by, some glanced, most did not stop. Her hands grew cold. Jack stayed behind her for a moment, holding out a bottle of water. Drink. She took it, nodded, and forced herself to breathe. Then she lifted her head and called out for the first time. Sticky rice cakes, meat and mung bean filling, with peanuts, freshly wrapped. Her voice sounded too soft to her own ears. A woman passing with a basket slowed a little, looked over, then kept walking. Tu Tien swallowed hard and tried again, louder this time. Fresh sticky rice cakes, full filling, soft rice, fragrant peanuts. Still, only a few people looked. Fear crept in quietly, almost like cold fog. What if no one bought anything? What if the cakes came home exactly as full as they had left? What if her hope had been too small to survive even one morning in the market? She looked down at the basket, then at Jack. He crouched slightly beside her and spoke in the calmest voice possible. You're doing fine. Just keep going. She nodded. So she straightened her back and called out again. And this time, an old woman finally stopped. The old woman bent slightly at the waist and looked down into the basket with the serious attention of someone who knew exactly how to judge food at a glance. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot, and one hand rested on the handle of a woven market bag, while the other touched the top leaf of one cake gently, almost respectfully. How much? She asked. 5,000 each, Tu Tien answered, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman looked at the basket again. What's inside? Pork, mung bean, and peanuts, Tu Tien said. Wrapped last night. The rice is soft. The woman glanced up at her face, then at Jack standing just behind her with the water bottle still in his hand, then back at the cakes. There was a brief pause that felt much longer than it was. Give me two, she said. Tu Tien blinked once, almost not trusting what she had heard. Then her hands moved quickly. She wrapped the cakes carefully, tied the leaf edges down, and accepted the money with fingers that trembled only slightly. The old woman tucked the cakes into her bag and nodded once before walking away. That should have been a small thing. But to Tu Tien, it felt like the first stone laid beneath a bridge she had not known how to cross. Jack saw the change in her face at once. Her eyes were still nervous, but something brighter had entered them. Now, relief? Yes, but also momentum. "See?" he said quietly. "You're doing it." She looked at the money in her hand, then at the basket, then back toward the crowd beginning to thicken at the edge of the market. A woman with a school-aged son stopped next. The child pointed first. "Mom, can I get one?" Tu Tien smiled more naturally this time. "They're soft," she said. "Good for breakfast." The mother asked a few questions, bought 3, and thanked her. Then a man came by for one just to try. Then 2 young girls sharing a bicycle stopped and asked for one each, giggling when Jack held out the water bottle to Tu Tien like he was her assistant and not a man in a pressed shirt who clearly did not belong in a mountain market. The market was waking up around them now. Voices grew louder. More motors arrived. The smell of fresh herbs, fried dough, fish, and wet soil began to mix in the warming air. But inside Tu Tien, the fear that had sat like a stone in her stomach since dawn was beginning to loosen. She adjusted her voice. Fresh sticky rice cakes, full filling, meat, mung bean, and peanuts. This time it carried farther, and this time people responded. Not everyone, some still passed, some looked and moved on. But enough stopped to matter. Enough bought. Enough smiled at the clean wrapping and the careful way she packed each cake. With every small bill that folded into her hand, the line between who she had been yesterday and who she was becoming today grew clearer. By mid-morning, half the basket was gone. Tu Tien sat a little straighter now. Her movements had become faster, more confident. She no longer stared at each passerby with the quiet panic of someone pleading for a chance. Instead, she greeted people, answered questions, and let herself believe that what she had made had real value. Jack stayed nearby without crowding her. Sometimes he stood behind her with his hands in his pockets. Sometimes he went to buy more string or paper wrapping. Once he returned with a cold drink and handed it to her with a look that said more than his words did. "You're doing great," he murmured. Tu Tien took the drink, and for 1 second, the rush of gratitude nearly made her cry. Not because of the drink itself, because she understood what his presence meant. He was not standing there because he doubted her. He was standing there because he wanted her to feel, even in the middle of effort and uncertainty, that she was not alone in what she was trying to build. She took a long sip and nodded. The sun climbed higher. Heat began to settle over the market. People moved faster now, wanting to buy and leave before midday fully took hold. Tu Tien kept selling. Her hands were sticky with leaf moisture and money. Sweat gathered lightly at her temples, but her voice stayed steady. A little before noon, a woman pulled up on a motorbike, looked straight into the basket, and asked, "How many are left?" Tu Tien froze for half a second. She counted quickly. "About 12, she said. The woman waved a hand. "Give me all of them." Silence hit her for one startled second. "All?" Tu Tien repeated, as if she needed to hear it again to be sure. "Yes, my children are home today. They'll eat them." Tu Tien moved fast then, wrapping the final cakes with hands that had suddenly gone almost numb. Her heartbeat was so loud she barely heard the rest of the market. When the woman handed over the money and drove away, the basket was empty. Completely empty. Only the faint scent of banana leaves remained. Tu Tien stared down at it as if it might somehow refill itself from shock alone. Then she looked up at Jack. Her whole face changed. "They're all sold, honey." The words slipped out so naturally that neither of them noticed it at first. Jack smiled, broad and relieved and proud all at once, and put one hand lightly on her shoulder. "You did it," he said. "Let's go home." On the ride back, the air felt cooler somehow, even though the sun was stronger. Or maybe it was only that her body had finally relaxed enough to notice the wind again. Tu Tien sat behind Jack with the empty basket held close, and she kept doing the math in her head over and over, half afraid she had imagined the whole thing. More than 100,000 in profit. Not a fortune, not something that would change everything, but enough. Enough to prove that this could become something real. Enough to let her believe she could help carry the weight of their life in a way that mattered. Enough to make the next batch feel worth the effort before she had even made it. Jack drove a little more slowly than before. Maybe because he knew she needed time to sit inside the feeling. He glanced back once at a stop near the roadside. "Tired?" he asked. Tu Tien laughed a real laugh this time, easy and bright. "No," she said, "I'm happy." And that was the truth of it. Beneath the sweat, beneath the heat, beneath the morning's fear and the hours of calling customers in a rising market, happiness had arrived. Not loud, not theatrical, but deep enough to steady her. When they reached the house, his mother was already waiting in the yard. She looked first at the basket, then at Tu Tien's face, then at Jack's expression, which gave everything away before either of them could speak. "They sold?" she asked. "All of them," Tu Tien said, and the pride in her own voice startled her. His mother broke into a smile so warm it seemed to brighten the whole yard. "I told you," she said, as if she had always known. People can taste care. For one soft, glowing moment, the three of them stood there with the empty basket between them, grinning like children over something much bigger than money. Jack set the motorbike stand down and turned toward Tu Tien just as his mother came close enough to touch her arm. "Well," she asked, "how much did you make?" Tu Tien named the amount and his mother let out a low approving sound. Jack laughed under his breath. Someone, none of them, would later remember who opened their arms first. And the next thing Tu Tien knew, they were all standing close together, held by the kind of joy that only comes after fear has been endured and proven unnecessary. The mountain air had changed by then. Afternoon light spilled gold across the yard. Leaves moved softly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then the world settled again. Tu Tien looked toward the banana trees and then toward the kitchen where she had wrapped the cakes before dawn. She thought of the soaked rice, the steamed mung beans, the strings, the banana leaves, the old woman who bought two first, the child begging for one, the final customer taking everything left. She felt something resolve inside her. Not loud ambition, something steadier. She would keep going. She would make more. She would learn what people liked, what sold well, what mornings brought the best customers, what kinds of feeling made people come back. She would do it not only for the money, but for what the work had given her today, a new shape of confidence, small but unmistakable, for family, for herself, for the life she was trying to build with both hands. The empty basket did not feel empty anymore. It felt like proof. And as the afternoon sun poured over the little yard and turned everything brighter than it had any right to be, Tu Tien stood in the center of that light and knew with a certainty she had not possessed that morning that this was only the beginning. Before sunrise, Tu Tien wakes to finish wrapping 60 sticky rice cakes by hand, hoping this small market trip might become the beginning of a steadier life for her family. In the quiet kitchen, surrounded by banana leaves, rice, and the smell of seasoned filling, she pours all her care into each cake. Jack insists on taking her to the market, and his mother quietly encourages her, reminding her to sell early while customers still have time to stop and look. At first, fear nearly overwhelms her as people pass by without buying. But one customer finally stops, then another, and slowly her confidence begins to grow. By the time the market grows busy, Tu Tien is no longer sitting there in silence. She is calling out, smiling, selling, and believing in herself. Then, just before noon, one woman buys every cake left in the basket. She returns home, exhausted but glowing, carrying her first real success, newfound confidence, and the hope that this simple beginning can become something lasting.